It is the appointed hour, I believe.
It is. I think it is
That's
indeed.
fantastic. Well, welcome, Liz. I asked to have the privilege of introducing you to Newcastle Presbytery. Liz and I met face to face anyway in January of 2018.
Yes.
It feels like it was a lot longer.
It really does, right? Oh my gosh, totally.
Oh, she came up to the Boston area to lead a retreat for us and then spoke at the Presbytery meeting. It was especially memorable because I was in a cast and not as functional as I needed to be to administer a retreat. But Liz is fantastic. She is co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for revival, and there's more language there. They have 14 points that they're within the first 100 days of the Biden administration, and they have a holistic approach to the issues that impact all of our lives. It's not just low-income people who live in poverty. Anyone who lives in poverty, their life impacts my life. Their life impacts the multi-billion dollars life. So the holistic approach about how we change our systems in order to create a more just, merciful, and loving society is, I find, powerful and moving. So Liz is here with us. She is also the founder of the Kairos Center in New York at Union Seminary and author of Always With Us, What Jesus Really Said About the Poor. So I'm going to take my video away so you have the full screen. People can ask questions in the chat. And if at times you want to invite participation, they can also ask to be recognized and share their audio and video. So
excellent.
Your call on that. Welcome, Liz. Take it
thank
away.
you so much. It's so good to be here with you. And thanks for the invitation to join in a workshop and a conversation about I think what Jesus really says about what our role as people of faith, as Christians, is in alleviating and in fact in ending poverty.
Yes.
The reason I want to start with the slide, and especially being able to see the bottom of it, is that this we hung up this poster more than 20 years ago when I was engaged in organizing amongst poor and homeless people in Philadelphia, and I think indeed part of what this is saying, right, is this: how can you worship a homeless man on Sunday and ignore one on Monday? What we know about Jesus, not just in his birth, where his family had nowhere to lay their heads, but also throughout the Gospels. We have this passage that foxes have dens and birds of the air have their nests, but the Son of Man, but human beings, that Jesus himself, has nowhere to lay his head. And so, indeed, what we know about the kind of context of the biblical passages that we're reading and of Jesus's life on earth is that he was one of the vast majority of people who were living in extreme poverty. And so indeed, on Sundays, we worship this homeless, refugee, low-wage worker, but then seem to not actually organize our churches and our society around the very kind of teachings and reality that he comes from. So I want us to look at the passage from Matthew 26, where this phrase that the poor will be with us always really comes. And this is just, these lines from 6 through 13. Now, while Jesus was at Bethany, in the house of Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster jar of very costly ointment, and she poured it on his head as he sat at the table. But when the disciples saw it, they were angry and said, "Why this waste? For this ointment could have been sold for a large sum and the money given to the poor." But Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why do you trouble the woman? She has performed a good service for me. For you always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. By pouring this ointment on my body, she has prepared me for burial. Truly, I tell you, wherever this good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her." I want us to start with this passage after that image, because what Jim Wallace says is that the most famous passage about poverty in the more than 2,500 passages in our sacred texts about the poor, about widows, about children, about orphans, about the marginalized. The most famous one is this line, "The poor will be with you always." I've been doing very grassroots anti-poverty organizing for more than 25, about 30 years. And really not a week goes by in my life where somebody doesn't quote this passage. Sometimes it's folks in our churches. Sometimes it's anti-poverty organizers. Sometimes it's atheists who know nothing about the Bible, but know that somewhere in it, Jesus said that poverty is inevitable. So with that, I think it's actually often helpful to go back to this passage and then back to our Bible to think about, is this what this passage is really teaching? I want us to think a little bit about it in this and look at this, but in the context of the role that the Bible plays in our lives. The Bible is the most widely read, distributed, and translated book in the United States. It's always on the top of our bestseller list. It's cited for moral stances. It's consulted for personal and social decisions people make. As Christians, we organize our lives around both the words and the teachings, as well as the traditions that we've been raised in, but about what we're supposed to do to follow the ministry that is set out in that Bible. And so I, in the work that I've done for a long time, tried to see what then people think and hear about this text. My own experience is surely reflected in the fact that, again, I can't go very far without somebody talking about this. But one time I did a Google search and I put it on this PowerPoint. There were 728,000 mentions of this passage, in these Google searches. And while I didn't actually read every one of those 700,000 messages, I did read hundreds. I did read thousands of them. And really, what I could see in those different entries was kind of a debate emerging about the role of Jesus and the Bible and faith communities in the eradication, the amelioration, in the work of poverty in our world. And what's very clear is that that debate looks kind of like this. Many of those entries were blog posts or reflections. Some of them were sermons. Some of them were political statements, and some of them referred to Matthew, like I just read, and some of them were from John, and others were from Mark. But all of them basically kind of centered around three different ideas. One, that we can't ever end poverty. Two, that it's the role of Christians to try to care for the poor, address issues of poverty. And it is not the role of our government. And that three, that the focus of this story and the focus of our sacred text is Jesus. Jesus should be our concern, not poor people. And so to me, that's it shows, a lot of what we believe is possible when it comes to these issues. And then I've read through, biblical scholarship and a lot of other kind of interpretations, of this text. And it's quite similar to really the debate that emerges on social media. Many of the kind of claims of biblical scholars, focus again on this kind of spiritualizing elements, that what matters in our text and in this text is heaven, not earth. Ritualizing, again, talking about Jesus and the rituals that we do around anointing his body or remembering his life. But again, instead of those rituals coming out of practices of poor people and of Jesus, kind of counterposing them from Jesus and the poor. Another kind of idea is individualizing, right? That yes, maybe we're called to do something in the face of poverty, even from this passage itself in Matthew and John and Mark. But that is individual charity. That's something like almsgiving. That's donating food or money. It's not a larger social program, a social response. And then really the last kind of theme of the kind of various biblical interpretations of this passage and of much of the Bible is about kind of blaming poor people for the situation that they're in and kind of moralizing that if people just acted right or a little bit better or different, that folks wouldn't be, in that kind of the positions that we're in. So I want us to look actually at this passage in the way that it shows up, and while we kind of look at it, have a chance to think a little bit about what it could actually really be saying, and what's happened before in Matthew 25 is the last judgment, right? That's at the very end of Matthew 25, and we've heard a very strong message that what you do to the least of these, what you do to the homeless, to the hungry, to the thirsty, to the imprisoned, is how you treat Jesus and God, God's self, and that's an actually admonition to nations, to entire nations, that how they treat the most marginalized, the one who is struggling the most, is actually how your whole society is judged. And so, for every society that has not organized itself around the needs and the demands of those who are poor and low wage and excluded and homeless, that's really a judgment on the larger society. Then we get into Matthew 26, and the very first part of Matthew 26, the first verses are about a meeting that's happening in the temple, where those chief priests and the leaders, the political and religious leaders of the day, are meeting and trying to talk about what to do about Jesus. Now they're talking about the threat that Jesus has caused, in part because he'd entered into Jerusalem in this kind of alternative procession on a donkey rather than in the chariots of empire. He had then gone into the temple, the center of the religious and political and economic, really, capital of the time, and he had disrupted the buying and selling that was going on there and engaged in what many of us will call like a nonviolent direct action. And then he flees like he is in this passage, to Bethany, to kind of escape from the authorities. The authorities, at the same time that Jesus is meeting with his disciples, are meeting to kind of plot out what they're going to do. And they're worried because we're in the midst of the Passover, a freedom festival, right? A celebration of the liberation of the Jewish people from Egyptian slavery. And folks are prone to get a little bit rowdy, get a little bit excited. And in that context, they meet and they say, we don't want to do this, at the height of these kind of religious and social celebrations and activities and protests that are going on, because a riot among the people might pop up. And then we get into this scene, and this scene is Jesus in Bethany. Now, what we know about Bethany is it's a real town. It's about 12 miles out of Jerusalem, and it indeed was a very poor town. Bethany in Hebrew means house of the poor. And then what we know about Jesus in this passage is that he's in the house of Simon the leper. A leper was someone who was ostracized in this day. We don't know actually a ton about what leprosy was, but we know that it came with a very severe social stigma. And people used much of the resources that they had to try to, both be welcomed back into the community as well as to address the public health crisis that they were in. But this man, Simon, has a house, and he's welcomed Jesus in. What happens in the first part of this passage is this woman comes in, and we don't know this woman's name. We don't, know what her where she comes from. We know very little about her, but she comes in and immediately pours an alabaster jar of myrrh, the Greek word for a holy anointing oil, whose recipe is in our Hebrew scriptures in the Exodus. And it's myrrh, when poured on this head, that is what it takes to anoint a Messiah, to anoint a prophetic leader who has been set apart by God to organize society around the needs of the poor. So this is where, in our Bible, in Matthew, where Jesus is anointed as the anointed one, as Christ. And it's over a dinner where he's trying to avert the authorities in the house of the poor, during the Passover celebrations. And then the disciples see this, right? The disciples are angry, and they kind of cry out against this, and they say, why this waste? Or in the Greek, they say, why this destruction? The word apoleia, destruction. For this ointment could have been sold for a large sum, and the money could have been given to the poor. And I think what we should notice in this passage is that this kind of idea, that we don't know where this myrrh comes from, but we know it's worth a whole lot. In fact, in Mark's gospel, it says that it's worth 300 denarii. So it's basically a year's worth of day laborers' wages. It's a lot of money, especially for a movement of very poor people. But the solution or suggestion here is that we should take this money and then go sell it in the same marketplaces that other luxury items are being sold. And we should get a bunch of money, and we should then give the proceeds to the poor. Now, I think the disciples are who we're supposed to relate to in this passage. It seems like they're trying very hard to have listened to Jesus and his instruction over and over again, including in Matthew 25, right before, of what you're supposed to do in the face of growing poverty. And that's that you're supposed to address the needs and concerns of poor people. And so they're saying, here, look at this. We found all this resources and this, and instead of anointing, you could have sold this money, and we could have used it. And we could have really paid for a lot of food, or helped a lot to house quite a few poor people with this money. And we should hear that that's still the solution that most of us have in mind when we hear about, growing poverty and inequality and hunger and homelessness. It's that we think that we should make a lot of money and then give the proceeds to the poor. But Jesus seems to have a reaction to this and a pushback in this moment. And he says, but he was aware of this, right? Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why are you troubling this woman?" And in fact, the passage kind of says, "Why are you trying to get her in trouble? Why are you giving her a black eye? Why are you taking things up with her? She's performed a good service for me, a mitzvah. She's done something good in the eyes of God and good in his experience, right? And indeed it is, right? I mean, so often in our Gospels we have Jesus caring for lepers, taking care of the sick, healing the lame, making sure that the poor are fed and that the food is multiplied. But in this situation, we have this woman who is indeed caring for him. And then he says this famous line, "For you always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me." Now, this first passage from this first half of this line, from 11, "For you always have the poor with you." It's a quote. It's a quote from Deuteronomy 15. And that's one of the most radical kind of Jubilee Sabbath prescriptions in the entire Bible. Walter Brueggemann, an Old Testament scholar that I really appreciate, says that that Deuteronomy 15, 1 through 4, are basically the most radical parts of the Bible that nobody knows anything about. And what it lays out in Deuteronomy 15 is that if you, as a nation, again, release slaves, if you forgive debts, if you pay your workers a living wage, and if you lend out money knowing you might never see it again, that your whole nation will prosper. That when you organize society around the needs of the least of these, it helps to lift everybody up. And so Deuteronomy 4 says, basically, if you're following the commandments that God is giving today, and those commandments are to, release slaves, to forgive debts, to lend out money, and to pay people what they deserve, that you'll never have a needy person among you. There will be no poor people among you. But then it kind of continues, and it says, and this is kind of paraphrasing, but more or less but you might not be obedient to this, and you might instead be a kind of a greedy nation that kind of hoards. And so then, if that's the case, you'll never cease to have the poor in the land. The poor will be with you always. But then it goes back and says, "So open your hand to the poor and needy neighbor." And so just in this passage itself, we hear that God's will is that there be no poverty, no poor among you, no deprivation, no depression, but only if we follow, what God has said needs to happen, which is, again, organizing from the bottom up, and ensuring that society does not let poverty and inequality creep in. And so when Jesus, quotes this, "For you always have the poor with you," even if we don't know that that's the kind of reference being made, it would have been very familiar to the disciples and to those that were gathered at this dinner, and this kind of, they would have been able to fill in the "for you always have the poor with you" because of society. Disobedience to God's commandments and God's will for Jubilee and Sabbath and prosperity and abundance for all. And so, it continues, and he says, "But you will not always have me." And this is a really important part of this passage, right? What we have going on here is that Jesus has tried to say to his followers up until this point that he won't be with them forever. And what we know from earlier on, in Matthew 26, is that indeed the leaders of the ruling society of the Roman Empire in Judea and Jerusalem are plotting what to do with this social justice leader, who is actually proposing that instead of Caesar's empire, instead of the Roman Empire, there is an empire of God, a basileia tautheo, we often translated as kingdom of God, a reign of God that is contending with Rome and contending with Caesar, and it's a reign that everybody has their daily bread and everybody has their debts forgiven, and earth is how it is in the skies, and that this is what God intends. And so there is this leader, Jesus, who's threatening the status quo, who's trying to upend, the way that Caesar rules, and he is going to be what we know is crucified. And what is crucifixion but actually a punishment for revolutionaries, for those that have been deemed a threat to the empire? Now, your common criminal, your murderer, your robber, that's not who's crucified. Who's crucified is those that have dared to kind of stand up to a violent, unjust system and say it doesn't have to be this way, and then try to organize, the people in a popular movement to transform that whole society. And so it gets passed. He says that he's not going to always be here, and so then the commitment and the vow to kind of bring earth to what looks like in heaven, or to enact the Jubilee, or to make sure that poverty becomes history, is transferred from just what Jesus is anointed for and who he's called to be to the people and to the disciples. And then he reminds us in this passage that by pouring this ointment on my body, she's prepared me for burial, and that he is going to die. And in fact, this kind of anointing, both as Christ, but then also as someone who should be cared for and who's going to die at the hands of the state. And what we know also about crucifixion is that what's so insidious about it is that often people don't get to be buried. And the only place indeed that his body is anointed, both as Christ, but then also to care and honor for him, after he's dead, is this anointing. And then there's these powerful lines. Truly, I tell you, wherever this good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her. Now, there's a couple of pieces of this passage that I think are really important. We first have to start with good news, evangelion, the Greek word that we get evangelical from. It's the Greek word that we get the gospel from, right? Gospel, good news. And again, any place that good news shows up, the word gospel shows up in our texts, it's connected to the work of doing justice. It's connected to the work of righteousness and of ending poverty and of addressing and healing of the sick and of healing of society. And so this very material, very ground up kind of good news, this good news, not of eviction, not of low wages, but this good news that it doesn't have to be this way, is really what we get in this passage, and that wherever this good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her. Now, as good Presbyterians and as people of faith, we know this passage of doing things in remembrance of. But what we're accustomed to is doing it in remembrance of Jesus, right? When we do that communion liturgy, when we get ready to honor and recognize, what we're a part of. We eat that bread and we drink that cup, and it's in remembrance of Jesus. But in this passage, he's saying what's been done, what she has done, will be told in remembrance of her. This reminds us of actually the kind of foundational work that the early Christian kind of ecclesia, churches, gatherings, associations were really about. Those gatherings, those ecclesia, those churches were in many cases also burial associations, mutual aid societies for poor people who didn't know what was going to happen to them when they died, and basically joined different social groups and religious groups like the early church and the early Jesus communities, who were then kind of burying and then remembering those that came before them. And what would happen is that you would gather in these ecclesia, you'd gather in these associations, these mutual aid meetings, and folks would, have a dinner, and they would raise a cup and they'd say, we remember, this person. And so when Jesus actually teaches us what we're supposed to do in our communion, he's actually reminding us of this whole powerful ritual that communion comes from. And it's a ritual of poor people who have been too poor to basically die, who have banded together to say, we're going to remember you and carry on your legacy into the future so that your dreams become a reality. So I want us to kind of pause for a second here, because I wanted to spend a little bit of kind of quick time looking at this passage, because again, I do believe it's the most famous one when it comes to the question of can we end poverty? And so what I'm hoping now is that we could have a little bit of interaction, whether if people have questions or comments, if you want to kind of come onto camera, and then we can kind of keep on going. I have some more slides and some video and some more, but I want us to pause for a minute right now and just think about this biblical passage. And I can turn my video off right now. Yes.
And if people haven't picked up this book, Always With Us, it is set up like a Bible study. I mean, it's a study book that you can use for a small group with questions and chapters. It's a good thing to pick up for any kind of group setting. So Terrence put a question in the chat, which may have been, rhetorical, but still, he said, somehow we get it when Jesus partially quotes Psalm 22 while on the cross. Why don't we get it here?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good point, and perhaps best in its kind of rhetoric. I mean, again, if you have a study Bible, it says that this is a quote of Deuteronomy 15. And so it's not that the clues aren't there. One of the things that I actually really love about this is the Jewish Publication Society, who have also put out, a Christian Testament, say that it's actually a quote of Deuteronomy 15:4, which is that you'll have no, if you follow the commandments that I'm giving to you today, there'll be no needy among you. And so that's kind of amazing. The NRSV says that it's a quote of Deuteronomy 15:11, which is that when you don't do that, the poor will never cease to be in the land. The poor will be with you always. But so the clues are there. And if you pull up Bible Gateway on your computer, I mean, again, like you see these references. It's not actually a controversial thing to say that this is quoting Deuteronomy 15, but it is true that it hasn't gone into our consciousness in the same way. as like Luke 4, where the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, has anointed me to bring good news. We know that that's quoting Isaiah, or when he's on the cross, the quoting of Psalm 22. There are a lot of these kind of intertextualities that happen throughout, and my best thought on this is that we want to hear it as Jesus is condoning poverty because our society has, and that maybe we don't individually want that. I'm not saying that I wish that upon any of us, but that if you look in the United States, the places that have the highest per capita churches also have the most amount of poverty. There's clearly a theological justification that poverty is okay, despite the fact that, again, if you cut the word poor out of our Bible, it literally falls apart. And that there is no more prominent teaching that runs from Genesis to Revelation, not just proof texting here and there, our favorites, whether it's from Matthew 25 or from wherever, or Isaiah 61 or Luke 4, but again, an arc that is throughout, that is about justice for the poor. And so we have that arc. We have passage after passage after passage that all speak against the inevitability or that God wills poverty. But still in our society today, there's a dominant theological narrative, a kind of battle, I would say, for the Bible, that has allowed us to actually think that it's okay to have poverty, and that Jesus is saying, maybe it's unfortunate, right? Like it's not, sometimes it goes so far as to, people just deserve it. But even in a more compassionate version, it's the story goes is it's unfortunate, but it's inevitable. And see here, it says it in this passage. So I think that we have chosen to ignore that, and instead basically read it out, even though it's also right there in our study Bibles.
Yeah. And Rourke comments in the chat that poverty is racialized. Yeah.
For sure. I mean, and there's no way for us to look at the issues of poverty, at least in the United States, without the long history, the original sins of racism, right? The genocide of the indigenous peoples, the U.S. chattel slavery system, unjust immigration policies that get set up, basically as the slave trade is being banned. I mean, it's all about, a racialized kind of economic system that where you have to address racism and poverty together if you're serious about addressing either. I mean, we live in a country that has 140 million people who are poor or low income. That's close to half of the U.S. population, and that's before this pandemic and before the kind of economic crisis that is accompanying that pandemic. Actually, that crisis had started before the pandemic, but again, it's surely been made worse. In those 140 million people who are poor, or one storm, one healthcare crisis, one job loss, one emergency, away from poverty, 60% of Black people are poor or low income, 65% of Latinos, 66% of indigenous folks. I mean, so you're talking, disproportionately really high poverty rates amongst people of color. And again, you can't separate that isn't, we have all of these wrong assumptions and wrong understandings about why people are poor and what makes people poor. And it's not, it's not connected to people's behavior or to who they were, what family they were born into. It's everything connected to the structures and systems. The Isaiah 10, woe to you who legislate evil and deprive the poor of their rights, right? I mean, it's that. So we have to look at these issues together, and by the racializing of poverty and the kind of misinformation about who is poor and why people are poor, and the kind of false narrative that exists that blames poor people and people of color and immigrants and queer people and women, for all of society's problems, that tries to kind of keep us pitted against each other, constantly fighting for a couple of bones, or for a better seat on the Titanic, and never kind of looking at where our resources are organized and distributed. And that gives out this lie that there's scarcity, that this is as good as it gets. I mean, that is what people basically believe and say. Like, maybe it's unfortunate, but we can't do any better than this. This is as good as it gets, right? When what that does for us, especially as Christians, is puts on God that God didn't create enough.
Yeah.
That God can't do better.
Yeah.
That this kind of poverty and inequality and racism is acceptable, when there's nowhere actually that is legitimately justified in our texts.
Yeah. Is that a good place to go back, or you want to stay here?
Yeah. So I'm seeing the kind of next question, and that's partly where I was trying to go, of sharing a little bit more about the Poor People's Campaign. And so what I wanted to do was to share a video. And I think this time I'll be able to share the whole thing. We'll see. And then talk a little bit about that work. Because I indeed do really believe that the movement that Jesus was building, that is being discussed and debated out in that Matthew 26 passage, was a Poor People's Campaign. That's what it was. And that we can learn from history, and we can learn from the Poor People's Campaign that someone like Dr. King called for in the last years of his life. But we can go back earlier. We can go back to Jesus. We can go back to Amos. We can go back to Isaiah, and these other moments. We can go back to the Exodus. But so I do want to show this video in part to ground us in who makes up the poor, and what the demands of poor people who are organizing really are. And so, all right, we're going to see. I think I can do it. You never know. All right. Is that working? Yes.
You can see it.
Can you hear it?
The screen share is muted. So if you unmute that and then mute yourself.
All right, let's see. All right, so what am I supposed to do? When I did this before, when we were practicing, it totally worked. So
isn't that how it works?
All right, so tell me again what I should do, and then I will try
so the screen share was muted, and so we were getting the sound through your mic.
Huh.
So if you share it again.
Great.
All right. Oh, now you're gonna have to back out of that. We had that problem today too. There, that's good.
Okay. Go back.
What happens in Wall Street often doesn't say a thing about what's
Is that better?
Yeah, so if you pause the video, and do you see how the microphone, the sound on the screen share?
Nope.
I cannot unmute it.
Nope.
Well, if you just turn up the sound really high, we'll get it through your mic.
Okay, we'll give that a try.
Everybody has a right to live.
The Poor People Campaign, a national call for more revival, has come up with a series of demands.
I know that you are here for the same reasons we all are here, to put our elected officials on notice.
The pain and the discontent is real, and the demands of our movement are moral.
We know what we want to focus on. Our agenda is clear.
We demand an immediate implementation of federal and state living wage laws. We demand the right for all workers to form and join unions. We demand equal pay for equal work. We demand a guaranteed annual income. We demand fully funded anti-poverty programs that protects the welfare of us all.
We demand the expansion of Medicaid in every state. We want single-payer universal health care, not for some, but for everybody.
An immediate restoration of the Voting Rights Act. We demand an end to racist gerrymandering.
We want early registration of 17 and 18-year-olds. We want registration to vote at age 18. If we can be drafted for war at 18, we ought to be able to vote automatically at 18. Early voting in every state, same-day registration, and the enactment of Election Day as a holiday.
We demand a reversal of state laws that prevent municipalities from raising minimum wage.
We demand an end to mass incarceration and the continuing inequalities of Black, brown, and poor white people with the criminal justice system.
We demand the right to vote for the formerly incarcerated. A clear and just immigration system. This includes providing a timely citizenship process that guarantees the right to vote. The First Nation, Native American, and Alaskan Native people retain their tribal recognition as a nation, not a race.
We demand decent housing. We demand relief from crushing household, student, and consumer debt.
We demand equity in education. We demand an end to the resegregation of schools. We demand free tuition at public colleges and universities and an end to profiteering on student debt. Equitable funding for historically Black colleges and universities.
We demand the repeal of the 2017 federal tax law. And we demand that the wealthy and corporations pay their fair share.
We demand an end to military aggression and warmongering. We demand a stop to privatization of military budget and any increase in military spending. We demand a ban on assault rifles and a ban on the easy access of firearms. We demand an end to federal programs that send military equipment into local and state communities. We demand that the call to build a wall at the U.S.-Mexico border be ceased.
We demand a ban on fracking, mountaintop removal, coal mining, coal ash ponds, and offshore drilling. We demand a ban on all new pipelines, refineries, and coal, oil, and gas export terminals.
We are demanding that we stop the war on our poor.
Somebody's hurting my brother. Somebody's hurting our sisters. And it's gone on far too long. And we won't be silent anymore.
We believe that we can win. We believe that we can win. We believe that everybody has a right to live So I wanted to start with that because I think it kind of frames a bunch of the work that we're trying to do. The Poor People's Campaign was launched with, much of the actions that you could see in this video, coordinated, nonviolent, direct action, civil disobedience, the most expansive and largest wave of nonviolent civil disobedience in the 21st century in the spring of 2018. And now we have coordinating committees in 45 states across the country, made up of poor and low-income leaders and clergy and advocates and activists and organizers from all across different issue areas, folks that are organizing around living wages and environmental issues, looking at the militarization of our communities and healthcare and access. We address kind of 5 interlocking injustices. We start with systemic racism, especially actually the attacks, racist attacks on our democracy, whether it's through voter suppression or for mass incarceration or unjust immigration policies and the mistreatment of Indigenous and First Nations peoples. We connect that with systemic poverty, the 140 million people who are poor or low income in the richest country in the world, the 15 million families that can't afford water, the 4 million families whose water, when they turn their taps on today, had poison coming out of it, the 62 million workers who are making less than a living wage, the tens of millions of people who are homeless. And again, all of this before the pandemic and has only been made worse this past year. And then we connected to the questions of environmental and ecological devastation. What we've seen is the communities that are hurt first and hurt worst from climate change, from extreme weather events, from the poisoning of our land and our water and our air, are poor communities, are communities of color. And that it's very clear that if we are trying to heal the nation, that we have to heal the planet as we go. And the next issue is the issue of militarism, the war economy, the fact that we as a nation spend 53 cents of every discretionary dollar on the military, but less than 15 cents on education and anti-poverty programs and healthcare, all combined. And then what helps to hold this all together, these systems of injustice, what Dr. King talked about in the last years of his life, of the tripartite evils of racism and of materialism and economic exploitation and militarism. But what holds all of these together really is this distorted narrative of Christian nationalism. And, we see that in lots of ways in our society. And we hear this kind of false narrative out there, that the real moral issues of our day are that Jesus was a card-carrying member of the NRA, or that we have to have prayer in schools, and not again what the Bible spends most of its time looking at of healthcare and just wages and education for our children. And all of these issues. And so the Poor People's Campaign is organizing and really trying to, as the kind of question posed, trying to really live out the message that Jesus gives to us, both in Matthew 25 and in 26, as well as across our sacred texts. And much of that work is really about both shifting the narrative, getting our nation, getting our world to talk about the issues that impact people and come forward with the solutions to those problems. It, in fact, costs our society more to have the levels of poverty and inequality that we do than it would be to resolve them. This year alone, our nation will spend $1 trillion on the costs of child poverty because we have so many kids that are poor. We know that for every dollar invested in early childhood education and other kind of programs that end and address child poverty, that we save $7 in other kinds of costs. And so again, it hurts our society to have this level of poverty. And we have solutions. We put together a budget. We put together a legislative agenda. We've put together a set of policy priorities, and all of them, we've done the work with think tanks and with policy folks. All of them are backed up, with real numbers. And so our job is to shift this narrative, hold out these solutions, and then to build power. Build the kind of power, the compelling power that, in the words of Dr. King, will make the powers that be, powers of this nation, say yes when they may be desirous of saying no. And so, so much, again, of the work is about organizing, making connections, drawing links, building bridges between all kinds of communities, and holding out the possibility that it does not have to be this way, and that what God demands of us and what we are called to do as people of conscience and people of faith is to indeed engage in developing and carrying out a moral movement from below. And so I wanted to pause again, because I now have just talked a bunch more, and see if we can have a little bit more, whether it's Q&A or whether it's, people want to come forward and make some points, ask questions, just to talk a little bit about the issues and the kind of organizing, movement building that is taking place today, and how folks are getting involved and can be involved in the work.
Awesome. Yeah, so if you want to come on stage, hit that share audio and video blue button, which is in the top right-hand corner of this gray box, and we can bring you up here, or you're more than welcome to use the chat as well. So we have in the chat from Kristen.
Great. So yeah, this question of recommendation of resources, books, videos, other kind of resources about this benefits of coming together. So I want to say a couple of things. So one is that there are a bunch of resources on the Poor People's Campaign website. I would really encourage folks. We have a saying in our work that we're not trying to be loud and wrong, so that we're basing our work in empirical, anecdotal data and research. And it's not that we just are saying we want these things. We're also connecting with economists and theologians and policy folks, and trying to construct a legislative agenda, a policy platform, a budget that makes it so. And one of the things that we have found as we've done that, and again, we have on our website an audit. It's called The Souls of Poor Folk. We have a Poor People's Moral Budget. We have a Justice Jubilee platform. And then we have these 14 policy priorities that we're working on right now. But what we found in the course of doing that work is kind of can be kind of summed up in a sweet little song or saying, which is that when you lift from the bottom, actually everybody rises. And I think that might not follow our kind of traditional economics in our day, but it does follow that passage from Deuteronomy and that Deuteronomic code and the manna in the Exodus and the admonitions from the prophets. It does follow what our Bible tells us to be the case, which is that again, it would seem surprising that if you raise wages and you release, forgive debts and release slaves and you lend out money, never going to get paid back. That in our way of thinking, in our day, that sounds like you're going to be, in bad shape. You might be a good person, but economically, that's not going that's not going to serve you or your nation well. And we're having that debate right now around the stimulus, right? Mm-hmm. You know, all of this conversation about is raising wages going to, you know, hurt small businesses? Is investing in deficit spending, you know, is it a deficit spending, or is it investing in education and healthcare and these kinds of things? What our sacred texts teach, and then also what economists have come forward to say to be the case as well, is that actually that when you lift from the bottom, when you organize first around the needs of the poor, which means that you're including the needs of everybody in it, that actually benefits larger society. And so there's a really good piece also on our website that's called, I don't know, Moral Policy Equals Good Economics. And we put this one out, you know, right before the new administration took power, with the Economic Policy Institute, some of the other pieces we've done with a bunch of think tanks, Institute for Policy Studies, the Urban Institute, you know, a lot of different groups, the Center for Human Needs, the Coalition for Human Needs, you know, a bunch of really powerful folks that are out there. But that basically says that actually what helps the economy is doing the right thing. And so those resources exist. You know, I would encourage people, again, to go to our website or to, you know, check out the Economic Policy Institute or the Institute for Policy Studies. They have a blog that's called inequality.org. On the Cairo Center website, we have a lot of resources. I'm the director of that center, and it's one of the anchor organizations of the Poor People's Campaign. You know, we put out a monthly policy briefing that explains a lot of these pieces, you know, especially specifically around healthcare, or specifically around, you know, like, so some of the data that says that, again, you know, this healthcare system that we currently have actually costs a lot more for a lot less healthcare. You know, so a lot of those kinds of resources do exist. And I would also recommend someone like Joseph Stiglitz, who wrote a book called The Cost of Inequality, right? And where he starts to talk about, you know, not just the moral costs, but also the moral cost, right? I mean, just that it hurts all of us when people are hurting. And we've seen this in this pandemic for sure. If anyone doesn't have healthcare, if anyone doesn't have a place to shelter and socially distance, that actually means that these kind of epidemics, these pandemics, these public health crises, you know, spread and grow very really. You know, I mean, you know, we just see this over and over and over again. But also the kind of economic costs that we spend more money on keeping the system in place than we would to make it work for a lot more people.
And we've got a couple people who have come up to the mic. So we're going to invite Terry Dykstra to come on stage. And I know Terry is active with the Poor People's Campaign in Delaware. Yeah, you have to now give your computer permission to share. And so just in case Terry can't make it work, Amy is also in the queue. So Amy, hopefully.
Yeah.
Amy got it first.
Woo, I'm here. This is really cool. Thank you for this platform. It's been really awesome all day. Liz, so I have just started a new pastorate here in Princess Anne, Maryland. I've been here since July. And Somerset County, the county that my church is in, fights for either first or second position of the poorest county in Maryland. You know, so as a new pastor here in the community, who would you suggest if I'm wanting to build and help build, you know, a moral movement, you know, a movement here who should be the partners that I should look for in the community? Who are the most, who have you seen as the most kind of powerful, or who to cultivate for anything to kind of really get traction in a grander scheme than just individual actions?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. And I think that there's both like the specific kind of organizations to reach out to, and then also the kind of larger principles of the larger kind of question of who. I mean, so I really follow, I read various biblical passages every morning. And then I also read a couple of quotes from Dr. King every day just to kind of ground myself. And one of them is from when Dr. King was kind of announcing the Poor People's Campaign in December of '67. He said, "The poor and dispossessed of this nation live in a cruelly unjust society. If they can be helped to take action together, they will do so with a freedom and a power that will be a new and unsettling force in our complacent national life." Now, that's a lot of words. I read it every day, so I know those words really well. But so when it comes to kind of the principle of who to reach out to, what history says and what Dr. King has shown is that those who have little or nothing to lose, like whether that's the low-wage workers in the neighborhood, whether that's the folks that are, caring for young ones and old ones in their homes and can't access, any kind of social benefits, whether that's the folks that, are in that close to 100 million people who actually have inadequate health care, despite spending a lot of money for it. So I think, so the principle is, how do we connect up with poor and impacted folks and other kind of moral leaders and clergy in an area to help to, take action together to unsettle the kind of complacent national life that we're living in. But then what I think it means, very practically is finding out, who is in the community. A lot of times, I think, to be honest, it works to start by doing surveys or conversations in our own congregations. I mean, if really that 43% of the U.S. population is poor or one emergency from poverty, those are some of the people that are in our pews. They just are. And also we're kind of connected to other people and efforts, right? That the way that moral movements grow is that people make connections and cross all kinds of boundaries that people aren't used to crossing, right? And so sometimes we start with whether it's the institutions in our community or even our congregation itself, and start to hear and listen to what are the issues that are kind of bubbling up for folks. Are there new pieces of legislation that are either really regressive or actually really hopeful? And are people gaining some energy and traction around them? What are people in this moment doing with the remote learning, with the lack of healthcare, with so many folks that have lost work? How is that playing out? And then there are, in many places, including in different parts of Maryland, Poor People's Campaign leaders. And so if you're not already connected, I would encourage you to reach out to the Maryland or the Delaware, or whoever else is on here, campaigns, because there are coordinating committees made up of regular people that are, again, impacted, and clergy and others that are trying to make a difference and trying to kind of come together and form unlikely alliances and bridge rural and urban and suburban and exurban communities, and see the commonalities and the differences we have, but also what it looks like to kind of come together across those issues. And so, I think there are institutions in our communities, and there are people that are also very aware about what's going on. And one of the things that I know from doing lots of really, 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 really grassroots work for lots and lots of years is that, starting with a couple of folks that are interested is enough. It really is. Like we don't need, the Moral Mondays movement in North Carolina started with 5 people that were willing to take a stand. The welfare rights organizing I come out of, we would often have, we'd be excited when we had 10 folk that would show up, like, so sometimes we think that like small and mighty isn't mighty. But it's the only way that things ever begin. And sometimes actually remain. But then you get lots of other small and mighty things that all come together, and then they're a big and powerful force. And so, I don't know, I'm sure there's more, but.
Thank you very much. I'll let somebody else ask their next question. So.
And we've got a couple more things in the chat. Something I often remind, especially our smaller membership churches, is that Jesus had 12.
I know.
Come on. and as Presbyterians, and maybe this is true in other denominations and faith communities, but this is the one I know best. We do tend to do a lot of research, and we read a lot, and we spend a lot of time talking about what's happening, and some of that is important. And like you said, Liz, we don't want to be loud and wrong. Our challenge, it seems, is often how do we move from the book group and the study and the sermon series, all of which help build that capacity. How do we move from that to taking action, to putting ourselves, our bodies, our time, the things that are precious to us into a space of action?
That's right.
So a couple of questions here. Going back to Mark, I've met many people who fear poverty and would rather avoid the issue. That's why many prefer salvation gospel over social gospel, forgetting or likely never learning the intricate connection between the two. And then I think what Terrence follows with, how do we link up rural and urban poverty when so much illegitimate effort is being invested in exploiting a nominal urban-rural cultural divide?
Yeah, so I think both of these are really, really important. I think shame and fear are really big. And I think especially in keeping kind of the narrative where it is, right? I remember starting to organize amongst homeless people in shelters, and many folk who just, like myself, I've been homeless myself, but many folks that found them ourselves, in a situation where we couldn't afford housing, or got evicted, or had to double up with a friend, or all the different situations that looks like. People would come to meetings and talk about other people, not talk about our own situation, because it's so hard and it's so scary, and I found many communities where people that are quite close to poverty really don't want to talk about it because it becomes too real and it becomes too close. And then you start to be like, oh, maybe I can't just blame people for the situation that they're in. Maybe there is something that's going on. And then also the solutions are things like, well, you're just going to raise my taxes then, and then I'm going to be in worse shape, right? And so we kind of don't have enough out of the box thinking about it. And then there is this shame and this fear. But people know about what poverty is. And if we don't actually bring out all of the passages in our texts, and then also the reality, the stories of people's lives today, and connected not just to sad stories, but to solutions, that it doesn't have to be this way. I mean, I was talking last week with a reporter at the Seattle Times. We were talking some about, this COVID relief package and 15 and living wage. And, she was kind of bringing all of the arguments that people have, including lots of my relatives and others, have against raising wages and against, investing and in all these kinds of things, investing in social programs, not investing in the stock market. And so we went back and forth. She was just asking all of these. And then at one point she paused and she said, I have never thought that it could be possible that there wouldn't have to be poor people in this country. She's like, do you get that a lot? She's like, it just never occurred to me. It never crossed my mind that poverty didn't have to be here in this country. Yes, I know we're a rich country. Yes, I know, so it wasn't like we weren't having like a scientific conversation. She was just like, but it never occurred to me that that the reason we have all of these things that are set up to kind of justify it or to explain away or to make us fearful or ashamed is because actually it's very possible. It's within reach. It doesn't have to be this way. And to me, it was a really brilliant moment of thinking about, how do you get people who want to avoid the issue to actually take on the fact that both our gospel and our life today has a real message for what we're supposed to do in the mix of this. And I think that that's really connected to this urban rural divide and these red states versus blue states and all of this kind of stuff. I mean, what we have seen, organizing, in person until the past year, where now lots of stuff is socially distanced and online, but still we're in communities all across the country all the time, is that people are coming together across all of those lines. We were doing a bunch of kind of voter registration and turnout in Georgia. And, it was the small towns in the rural areas, people, poor white people, poor Black people, poor Latino people, who were all coming out in really large numbers to say, we hear finally candidates talking about living wages and just health care and, relief and addressing systemic racism. Yes, even in poor white communities, people are excited about talking about addressing racism. It's just not what we hear. It's just not. And so the debate is all about this cultural divide. But the reality is that, in the hollers of Kentucky, or the saying that they've taught me from Kentucky, from the hood to the holler, people are coming together and organizing together, and there's a lot of potential there. And so I think sometimes when that story doesn't get told, or in fact when another story gets told, right? I remember being in Harlan County, Kentucky, where folks were talking about, and it was, middle of the day, but packed, hundreds of people. And folks said that, nobody had come to Harlan County until Trump did in the 2016 election, since when Johnson had gone to Harlan County to declare the war on poverty, and then no one had ever returned. And folks said, again, like this huge group of people, all ages, actually, mostly white people, because that's mostly who lives there, but also Latinos and Black folk and others that are from that parts and different parts of the state. And folks said to us, when the KKK or when one of these white nationalist groups comes through, all the media can do is talk about it, and it can be 10 people, and they can mostly be from not around here. And they're like, but when we have a protest or a vigil of hundreds and hundreds of people around unity and about anti-racism and about anti-poverty work, it gets no attention. And they're like, we're starting to think that they're not telling the story because they don't want to hear that we're actually linking up. And to me, that was a powerful story, right? Just that, yes, there are some really bad things going on in this society. But there's also people coming together across all of these lines in these powerful ways. And maybe we just aren't hearing about it enough, because when I get to be out there or on these kinds of screens, but then in these different communities, it's amazing. And so I just think we have to link up, and people are folks are seeing that they don't want to be pitted against each other. Folks are seeing that the issues might manifest in different ways in different communities, but the demands and the kind of asks are very similar. and people are coming together.
Yeah. A lot of it comes down to the stories we tell, which is part of our faith tradition. We're people of the book. We're people who tell the story. I love to tell the story. It will be my theme and glory. And yet we let other people tell us stories about who we are, but also about what it is to be in this country and to be a Christian in this country. We let other people try to define that for us. And that's a whole nother thing. We have 5 minutes left. Can you believe it? And there have been a lot of questions and comments rolling in the chat. Yes. So 5 minutes. How do you want to take your last 5 minutes, Liz?
Yeah, so I might kind of try to tie a couple of the questions that I'm seeing here into maybe some closing comments or whatever.
Okay.
But particularly around this kind of question that Victoria seems to raise in the context of Christian nationalism in our churches. How do you reverse the tendency to interpret Scripture to fit unjust political goals, to interpret Scripture to yield goals of justice? And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that, because again, I'm in a group of Presbyterians and I'm wanting to talk about the Bible a little bit. I think it's important for us to have this context that, that throughout history, whenever there have been kind of people coming together to right some of the wrongs, that there's always this kind of theological back and forth. There's always, and Christian nationalism as it is now is different, but it still has roots in how it has been. So, in the abolitionist movement, in the time of U.S. chattel slavery, there was this slave Bible that was produced, right? And it didn't include the Exodus, and it didn't include the prophets, and it didn't have any of Jesus's, I've been anointed by God to bring good news to the poor and release to the captives. And folks quoted the book of Philemon about a slave returning to his Christian master. And folks, use these different household codes from some of the Pauline epistles to say that slaves should obey their masters, right? But that wasn't the end of the story. At the same time, you had, Frederick Douglass talking about, and there's these beautiful sermons and these beautiful speeches where he talks about how he had prayed for a long time, but he didn't start to see, things start taking place till he started praying with his feet. Or you have Harriet Moses Tubman, and that wasn't a cute little nickname. Like, the Underground Railroad was seen as modeled after the Exodus. And then we can go to other moments of history. We can go to the social gospel movement, and we can go to the civil rights movement. We can go to the women's suffrage movement, right? And what we have is, people taking action together, being compelled to act because they are so willing to risk everything to be free that they do it. But then also this kind of battle around the Bible and biblical interpretation and theology. And so I have found that it will not be possible for us to really address racism and poverty if we don't address it in our minds, if we don't abolish the idea that it's inevitable and the way that God intends. And I don't think we can end it with our hands if we believe in our minds that, again, that this is how it's supposed to be, or that this is what God intends. So I think it means that we can't cede the Bible. We can't allow for Christian nationalists to be the only ones speaking about Christianity. I think it also means that we have to see that, again, we can't just worship a homeless man on Sunday, but we have to not keep on ignoring them on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday, but to see that, like, the kind of call to build a movement from below that is a religious, spiritual, moral revival of our values, of who we want to be and who we're called to be, and then that we answer this call. And so that means to me that we sometimes go to those hard places. We go to those hard texts. We unearth some of those assumptions. We confront the fear and the shame. We assume, yes, that there have to be poor people among us right now if we're really living in a society that has the level of inequality and poverty in it. And that we also then know that we have the power to do something about it. And so to me, I hope that folks do get involved, maybe in the Poor People's Campaign and the work that the Cairo Center is doing, but if not, with work of justice in your community, in your world, and never allow us to believe and to put on God that this is as good as it gets, because it isn't. We can do a lot better, and God wants us to.
Amen. Amen, amen, and amen. Oh, thank you so very much. Thank you for hopping in to our Bay retreat. Thank you for everything you and Dr. Barber are doing and the Poor People's Campaign, and for modeling for us that we can make a difference if we put one foot in front of another.
That's right.
Thank you.